Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for probably a couple of weeks worth of reading, 6 books in all. First is Mona by Argentinian author Pola Oloixarac. Apologies, I've probably butchered that. Translated by Adam Morris. Wolfgang Hilbig, The Tidings of the Trees, East German author, translated by Isabel Fargo Cole. Poetry collection by Tom Chivers called How to Build a City. Denton's new, in fact all the next 3 books are all recently published. Denton, Irish author, All Along the Echo. Charlene Elsby, Musos. And Maddie Mortimer's Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies. So I'm going to start with Mona, who is an author who has been nominated for a Grand Literary Prize in Europe, held in Sweden, and she and the other 12 nominees go to attend a 5-day literary conference, and then the winner of this grand prize and €200,000 is announced at the end of the 5-day session. And Mona bestrides through the airport departure lounge in America like a colossus, very much reminded me of the scene of Bob Hoskins in Long Good Friday. Bob Hoskins plays a gangster, and he just dominates the screen as he sort of marches back through Heathrow Airport's arrivals, because he owns London effectively, or he runs it. And Mona very much has a similar sort of presence. She's drugged up to the eyeballs. She's studiously ignoring texts and other messages from would-be suitors or copulation buddies. She's very much in control of her life, very self-possessed. She's a hedonist. And part of the problem of the book, even though I did enjoy it, but part of the problem of the book is we move from that Colossus Mona to a rather sort of passive, once she's in this thing in Sweden, rather passive, listening to others, not really offering her own worldview. But anyway, the book is essentially poking fun at the world of publishing and how authors have to compromise their creativity in order to be marketed a certain way, to become a brand. And there's a lot of identity politics that are, they are expected to write from their cultural community, which is not a new thing. In the 1980s, the Greater London Council, which is London's local government, were giving grants away to artists. But the catch was they had to make art. To minority artists or artists from minority communities. But the catch was they had to make art based in their community. And I had an Irish playwright friend who was a recipient of one of these grants, who didn't want to write about the troubles in Northern Ireland, but kind of had to in order to get the money. Anyway, and just sort of on that sort of identity politics in publishing, which it very much this book very much pokes fun at, and reminded me of Gina Apostol in its sort of snarky tone, which is no bad thing, I think. And it's interesting that 2 women writers are probably the best at conveying that. Mona had arrived at Stanford not long after the waves she made with her debut novel tossed her onto a beach of a certain impetuous prestige, and at a time when being a, quote, woman of colour in the vade mecum of American racism began to confer a chic sort of cultural capital. American universities shared certain essential values with historic zoos, where diversity was a mark of attraction and distinction. By playing the part of an overeducated Latina adrift in Trump's America, Mona experienced academic captivity as a sort of serene freedom. Mona's identitarian fantasy was quite well received on campus. It related to her research topic, and offered her the opportunity to advance her career merely by being herself, as much herself as humanly possible. Later she realised it would have been even more advantageous to add on some kind of physical disability. A slight but evident defect, but nobody's perfect. So you get the tone of it poking fun at identity politics, where it's seen to be inimical to true freedom of creativity. Auto-fiction comes in for a bashing as well. But it goes a bit mad at the end. With not many pages to go, it sort of veers off with two, great changes of tone. So the first is it gets very dark, and it does sort of relate back to the fact that Mona's a bit more muted in this company than she was when she started the book, but it's still a bit of a jolt just how dark it gets. And the second one is it gets a bit kind of supernatural. Now I assume that's a sort of a metaphor rather than actual supernatural events happening, but it was bizarre, and I knocked a star off for it, because it was so sort of, I'd been enjoying the book all the way through, enjoying the humour, enjoying the world of the writers it portrayed. I was playing a game of, I wonder if this really happened on one of the events she attended, and things like that. And that was great fun, and it was light. And then suddenly it just went a bit mad, and not in a very good way. So I gave it 4 stars. The Tidings of the Trees by Wolfgang Hilbig, East German writer. The book starts off with an author who's written the first line of his book, which is, "The cherry lane had vanished." And Cherry Lane, by its name, was a lane with cherry trees, which is, when this novel opens, have been cut down. And he's struggling to sort of remember his childhood, of climbing those trees and sitting in those trees and observing the world, because the trees have gone. He's gone back to the place. They're not there. He doesn't have the same elevation, the same perspective, and also the area has become a garbage dump, and it's sort of spreading, growing bigger and bigger and bigger. So he's really struggling to harness his own memory as truth. So that's the sort of the subjective I of a writer, the ego I, and he thinks, well, maybe that's not the way to go. I can't do ecological truth because the landscape has changed. It was bombed in the war. These strip mines have been abandoned. Now it's just this garbage dump. So even the ecology is ever shifting. The garbage site just keeps growing and growing and engulfing, and a whole village has been abandoned and has succumbed to this garbage creep. So he thinks, well, maybe I should be writing about the soul of the East German nation under communism. But he realises that they're schmucks, basically, that they buy into the state propaganda and they believe it. Because one of the things the state says is the fact that you have this refuse dump is testimony to the success of East German communism, that for the consumers you get all this up-to-date state-of-the-art stuff, and this garbage dump represents all the superannuated obsolescent stuff that has been replaced. And we know that's not true. The whole point of the Berlin Wall having to be erected in the first place was all the shiny bauble stuff on the western side of Berlin, and that the East Germans craved for. So that's not truth by any sort of objective status. And the only other truth he perceives is that the garbage men who tend this garbage site and order it as best they can, they are on the outside, on the fringes of society. They don't interact with anybody else, so they're not like the masses. They don't speak to anyone. They don't interact with anyone except each other and themselves. So he thinks they embody some sort of silent wisdom, and he definitely wants to sort of commune with them, because maybe that's the truth of the book that he needs to be writing. And there's a brilliant metaphor about this. So one of the things he finds in the garbage dump is some shop mannequins. So he decides he can use that to open up a sort of communications channel with these garbage men. Once a sort of gatekeeper was set up to meet me at the entrance to their shed. A naked mannequin leaning on a stick that might have been a sword, its face adorned with terrifying Indian war paint. I stood a second figure beside it, putting a pen in its right hand. I turned the head of the first dummy towards the second one, washing the paint from its face, so that it looked as though the two were in communication. The day after that they turned my figure, the second dummy, and leaned its forehead against the wall, taking the pen from its fingers and inserting it between the buttocks of the slightly spread legs, where it stuck out 2/3 of the way, rather obscenely. The other dummy's face gazed into the distance once again. one arm raised and outstretched. The gatekeeper gestured out past the grounds, pointing alarmingly eastward over the cherry lane towards the woods and beyond. It's just so brilliantly done, as I found in the three, the other two Hilbig books I've read as well. They're very short, they're novellas really, and he packs so much in them. Vanishing is a theme that appears in all three books, as much as this trying to find the voice of a writer in repressive, artistic East Germany. The vanishing in this case is not only Cherry Lane and the trees, under the garbage that spreads everywhere, but it's also the vanishing of the other people who could hold memory for him, which are his schoolmates when they used to play in the cherry trees in the summer. But they've all vanished because they've all gone over to West Berlin before the wall was erected, leaving him behind. So vanishing is a key theme of this book. But brilliant again, 5 stars, as have all 3 of his books been. And he's got a new one, I think he's dead, but a new one is being translated called Interim, which is being published this month. So and I've pre-ordered it, so I'm looking forward to that. And on to a poetry collection, How to Build a City by Tom Chivers. Now this was name-checked in Lee Rourke's poetry book called Vantablack, and it was praised very effusively in the poem by Lee Rourke, so I thought I'd check it out. And I have to say Lee Rourke's collection is much more satisfying than this. Now Tom Chivers, when he wrote this book, was the writer in residence at the Bishopsgate Library in London, and I know that library very well. In my day job we work with them and they hold our archive and things like that, and so it's too transparent to me, a lot of the prompts and the cues behind these poems about Bishopsgate Library, about the archives of sort of radical politics in London it holds. And when you can see the scenes, it doesn't tend to be a great success, I felt. There was one poem I did really enjoy called 7 Varieties of Not. I'll just read a couple of stanzas from that. 10 tons of bus pulls in, shish kebab through the semi-transparency of window, acridity and loveliness in perfect equilibrium. I could hug a steaming cone of Donna. I could come off reeking of place at 3 a.m. Waiting at the request stop, I was asked for the time by a man with multiple stab wounds and a noseful of claret. I offered my handkerchief, but he wouldn't have it, landing so dark. When you hear the sirens wail, you run, just run, and the night unravels like a Turk's head knot. So I enjoyed that because it was a very sort of impressionistic poem about sights and sounds and smells of London. And I could relate to that as a Londoner, but without. And yeah, the cues were stuff that he'd observed himself, but they weren't institutional cues, as I felt he had in a lot of other poems from his time at the Bishopsgate Institute. So I gave this 3 stars. So Danny Denton, All Along the Echo. This is his second novel. The first was The Early King and the Kid in Yellow, which is a brilliant book, 5 stars when I read it. Very lyrical language, and this is also about language, but it's not lyrical. This is about a chorus of language, chorus of voices, snatches of language. It's a sort of great sort of soundtrack of modern day Ireland. So it is quite different in tone, I feel, from The Early King. The Early King. So its 2 main characters are Jonathan Mooney, who is a radio talk show host, and his producer Louise. And a lot of the book is the snatches of conversation with callers calling in about their concerns or their complaints or commenting on world events. So you get all these different snatches of language. It builds up this mosaic of modern day Ireland, and I thought that was really effective. One of the world events that is purely fictional in this book, but very interesting inversion, is that London is labouring under a massive terrorist attacks and has become heavily insecure, like Belfast in Northern Ireland was during the Troubles. And here it's the former colonial power London that is now suffering it. And a lot of Irish expats who live in London are fleeing for safety back to Ireland and being welcomed with open arms, except there are some who feel that, well, we stayed in Ireland all the time through the bad times as well as the good times, and yet you're getting sort of privileged support because Lou and Johnny, every Friday through 1 month, take off on a road trip to 4 major cities in Ireland in a car provided by sponsors for a competition. And that competition is to win the car and a year's worth of free petrol by basically the first person to present in each of these cities get entered into a draw out of a hat, and one person will win the car. But the catch is that the only people who qualify are those who've recently returned from London, and that's why some of the people are with open arms to their former brethren and sisters, coming back to the homeland, and others are sort of, well, why do they qualify for the car but we can't, kind of thing. So it's a central metaphor to this whole London returning from exile situation. Very interesting concept. I really enjoyed that. There's a very this is a book of disembodied voices, but there's a particular duo called First Voice, Second Voice, who are so disembodied that they are listening to recordings of Johnny's show and commenting on them, making philosophical comments, but also commenting on the politics of the time and on the personal lives of Johnny and Louise. They seem to be playing it back from some time in the future when maybe a disaster has overtaken the world, be it ecological or nuclear war or whatever. And you never quite get to the bottom of what these two voices actually are. They're very much a mixture of Estragon and Vladimir in Godot meets Krapp's Last Tape, because they're playing back these old shows that no longer have the context that they did, because the shows are in the 21st century. They have context to us. It makes sense to us. They give a picture of it. But these guys, or these voices, seem to be sometime in the future when the context doesn't seem to hold anymore. Very, very interesting. So all of that is really good. But I knocked off a star because ultimately, having set up this thing about sort of fragmented voices and choral voices, the book really just became about the stories of Johnny's family life and Louise's family life. And they're very good stories and they're very interesting, they're very well done. But it seemed to deviate from the promise of the form of the book. I found it hard to reconcile that. Also, I found it peculiar that the central metaphor was a radio talk-in show. It seemed very old-fashioned to me. Yes, those shows, my mother still listens to them. They do still exist, but they have tiny audiences. Because anyone who wants to get something off their chest or complain about something will go onto social media and do it. And everyone has that, or pretty much everyone has access to that. And it's a much bigger arena, and it's much more brutal than anything in this book. So this felt quite old-fashioned in its choice. And finally, there are a lot of interesting ideas, but none of them are resolved. The stuff about our returning exiles ultimately became a plot device and a discussion point for the voices and people calling in, and a plot device to win the car. We never really dug deep into potentially more interesting aspects of that. Who are those two voices? What do they represent? What's their philosophy commenting on? Again, not really resolved. So I did knock a star off that. I did enjoy this read, and it was satisfyingly different from Early King and the Kid in Yellow. But it just lacks something, I felt. So 4 stars. On to Charlene Elsby's Musos or Musos, or however you pronounce it. The third of her books I've read. This just came out. Perhaps the most experimental in style. It reminded me a bit of Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, in that you don't know what level of reality the voice exists on. When it's about a man who may or may not have murdered his girlfriend, and may or may not have assaulted another woman. Just like in American Psycho, you don't know if he was really killing those women or it was all in his head. Similar here, I felt. And it seemed to be asking the same questions in the other 2 Elsby books I've read, which is, 2 people in a relationship, can they ever genuinely penetrate the subjectivity of the other, or are they always destined to remain outside? Are all humans destined to remain outside? The difficulty of communication, and the guy in here, it's very much about sort of not wanting to lose her or for her to leave, but that's about him and not her needs and wishes. So it's very much about two people in a relationship. Are they both I's, as in the first person singular, or can there be a we, or is it always destined to be an I and a you? The two characters are very much he's the I and she's the you. I didn't really know where this book what it was ultimately trying to say. She's investigated those themes before in a less diffuse way. I did think it was more interesting in this rather diffuse way, I have to say, but she wasn't able to advance her own theories any more in this than she did in those. So again, I was slightly disappointed in this. 4 stars. And on to Maddie Mortimer's debut novel. Maddie Mortimer is 26 years old, and what a sophisticated piece of writing this book is. It was extraordinary. So it's about a woman called Leah, who shortened her own name for Amelia to Leah, Lia. She's 43 years old. Her breast cancer has returned. She's married to Harry. Her mother is Anne, who's a widow. She has a daughter called Iris. She has a best friend called Connie. And the only other person in the cast of characters is her first love, called Matthew, who was an orphan, who was taken into her family house when she was a kid by her priest father, because the priest father was going to mentor Matthew to become a priest himself. And as she grows up, she has a torrid relationship with Matthew. They become sexual partners. He breaks it off with her to go and pursue his religious calling. But they're doomed lovers. They keep going back towards each other until it breaks up for good, and then she eventually marries her husband Harry, but never really losing the place in her heart for this guy Matthew. So that's what it is. It's a story about this quite limited cast of characters. One of the reasons it's limited is that she had, as growing up in a vicarage, that she was quite isolated. And one of the things she said, she's gone to a sort of load of school friends, not really her friends, but in the lake in the summer, and she's joined in. And she sort of says, she was never bullied because all her classmates knew that God would know, because her father was a priest, and therefore God would see them bullying her, and so they didn't bully her. But it was an expression of just how isolated she is, that she gets this sort of special treatment, which is basically to be sort of ignored and shunned because she was too risky, because of her family background. But anyway, then there's this other set of voices which are internal from her body, led by a choral leader who is a provocateur, who's a bit of a sadist, really. Maybe the voice of the cancer, but I don't think it is. I just think it's, we don't know our own bodies well enough. We can read certain signs of decay or whatever, but as a holistic whole, we don't know our bodies, and that is the voice that is very prominent here. He manipulates her, and I don't think she's aware of that manipulation. So, for example, he will offer her and put into her consciousness certain memories, and she's not aware that they've been prompted by this, this physical connection. And sometimes their memories prompted by things as and when she encounters some echo of them, but other times they're just done for giggles and lols, except they're nasty. They're not nice memories. And one of the successes of this book is the echoes through use of words and images. So there are lots of short sections and passages, and one will end, and then the next one will be with different probably a different time frame, either back to her child or in the current with her own daughter or husband or whatever. But there'll be a word or a concept echoing, and it's masterfully done. There's also visual stuff done with the layout of certain things, but again, not overly done. It's not gratuitous. So it's just a splendid. As I was reading this, I thought, well, this is a story about these characters, and it's very well done, and but it's 4 stars. But what lifts it to 5 stars is when we've had all the stuff about life, and then towards the latter part of the book, it's the stuff about the cancer is going to win and she's going to die. I mean, it's not really a spoiler, and for a 26-year-old to write about the run up, the lead up into death in such a sophisticated, empathic way, I thought was extraordinary. It lifted the book to 5 stars for me. I mean, it's terrific piece of writing. So yeah, just you've got to be in the mood, because it is a book about someone with cancer. Not all the way through. I mean, there's a lot of joy in the book, particularly between the mother and the daughter. I say the mother and daughter, Iris and Leah, and Leah and her husband Harry. Very interesting stuff about religion with the mother Anne, who is devout but widowed, left behind, and the slight cracking of her faith I thought was very interesting, because Leah is an atheist, a vowed atheist, which basically meant Anne shunned her, particularly when Anne found out about the relationship with Matthew. It was almost like Matthew was the prodigal son, adopted, and Leah was kicked out as the no good atheist. Just really, really good. 5 stars. So there you have it. Just to recapitulate, Mona by She of the Unpronounceable Name, 4 stars, good fun. As I say, went a bit mad in the end. The Tidings of Trees by Wolfgang Hilbig, yet again 5 stars. I love this guy. Tom Chivers, How to Build a City, slightly underwhelming, 3 stars. Danny Denton, All Along the Echo, I would recommend to read, but it's a 4-star book rather than a 5-star book, unlike The Early King and The Kid in Yellow. Musos by Charlene Elsby, interesting, challenging, but something unsatisfying about it, 4 stars. And Maddie Mortimer, Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies, 5 stars. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'm not sure what I'm going to read next. The new Gillian Barnes novel, Elizabeth Finch, turned up this week. I might start that. It's quite a short book. Jennifer Egan's new novel is due to drop within the next week, 10 days, so I should probably get to that quite soon. But I've only just finished the Maddie Mortimer about half an hour ago, so I haven't really thought through what I'm going to read next. But till next time, thanks very much.